Ladies, gentlemen, and Harajam of all ages, yesterday we had the proper developer stream for Vessel of Hatred and for Season 6 as well. And along with that, we had a nice roundup of the changes made since the PTR, as well as just full patch notes for the version of the game that we will be getting. And so I thought it would be fun to sit down, look at these patch notes, and compare it with information and testing done by players on the PTR to essentially just talk about how each class is currently faring with all of this information included together, the expectations of how things will look going into Season 6 and Vessel of Hatred. And we'll of course be going in alphabetical order with the classes, so first up is Barbarian. Barbarian was on the relatively weak side of things compared to other classes in Season 5, then for the PTR they did do a few things including reworking the formula for the damage increase from main stats. Barbarian of course has the most main stat potential of any class from gear due to having 4 weapon slots including multiple two-handers, so this uniquely did make them stronger than it did the other classes, benefiting from the same change and boosted them up a bit. Now, however, they have reverted that change back to how it works in Season 5, which has brought Barbarian a bit back down. Generally speaking, they have changed a lot of conditional bonuses on Paragon legendary glyphs to less conditional ones, and this is pretty similar across the board for most classes, so you can't really say it affects one more than the other, though the main actual normal node increasing glyph for Barbarian was based around one-handed weapons before and now isn't, so that is a very positive change. The overall multiplicative value of the legendary glyphs as well has dropped quite a bit, but it has done so equally for everyone, so while this constitutes less power relative to monsters, it shouldn't overly affect the standing between the classes themselves. That said, to move to more Barb-specific stuff, Mighty Throw is a new skill that was added in the PTR, which is pretty fun in use for Barbarian, but seemingly a little bit limited on actual power even if fully built compared to the best Barbarian builds. From theory crafting and testing it just isn't strong enough to be a focus of a meta build quite yet, but it did also get a buff to the upfront damage and a boost to the barrier generation on Fighter's Mighty Throw, which definitely isn't bad, but probably is not quite enough to change this either, I don't think. The new Thorns key passive has genuine promise as well. Thorns Barbarian has always been a pretty up and down concept that has always done surprisingly well at a high end, because Thorns builds scale directly with gear quality. Having better Thorns rolls on your gear makes the build notably better, so things are looking up for Thorns for sure, just from the existence of that key passive. That said, there was an interaction that was a bit busted with the Tough as Nails passive on the PTR that has since been fixed, so put simply, this just has a lot of promise and potential, but it will require further testing to see how viable it is, because there are changes that have been made since the PTR, which we haven't been able to test yet. Barbarian overall is in a pretty okay state. It's probably in the lower third of classes from what we know power-wise, but it's not at all an unplayable class, and if you like Barbarian builds from last season, they'll still be going quite hard this season, and if you like Thorns, this is one of the options to take advantage of that too. Then second up is Druid, my original love. The biggest change on the PTR was the new skill added in with Stone Burst. This is a channeled skill that scales its size and damage the longer that you channel it, and honestly, anytime a channeled skill exists that stops you from moving your player, I have my reservations about it, because that is a problem in the way that Diablo's combat works. This is Druid's second channeled skill that you can't move while casting, especially the fact that it's the second core skill that works that way. That said, there were a lot of bugs on the PTR that made it hard to test this core skill properly. We know it wasn't strong enough, and that if it was used at all in higher tier builds, it will likely end up being used more as a utility tool and an enhancement for other skills through something like the Shattered Defenses aspect that's being added, which makes using Stone Burst increase all other skill damage you do to an enemy by a massive chunk, and so this will most likely be used just to power up builds that focus other skills rather than as a focus itself. Though this buff to its damage in the patch notes could change that at least a touch, we would have to mess with it to find out properly. The main big thing of note from these notes though is that the Bold Chieftain aspect was nerfed significantly to now be based off of active cooldown remaining rather than overall cooldown, which mostly just means that the Debilitating Roar and Flesh Render build that was kicking ass on the PTR is pretty effectively killed off by the developers here. And while I do think a shout-based build is a really fun concept, if it is optimized by having literally only 2 active skills on your bar, then maybe it's a bit of an issue with that build. But then they did something even more unexpected than that and made it so the Nature's Fury key passive will no longer trigger off of landslides that come from the Earthbreaker unique ring. It only triggers from hard casting landslide itself on your bar. And this is honestly completely build destroying for the currently existing Stormslide concept in a way that is really just sort of not fun. I mean, let's be real, intended or not, Stormslide as a build concept was just really cool, so I'd rather that they found another way to nerf it than something like this. However, they did also buff the Earthbreaker ring as a sort of compensation for this, and the the amount that it is buffed by is nearly 3 times the effectiveness at a top-end roll, so this could still have promise in a more pure landslide-focused build, but it has without a doubt just gutted the 2 top builds that Druid had on the PTR. Overall, Druid is in a fine position. I'd say likely to end up as the 4th best class this season, with Stormslide builds still doing their thing of course, and worth noting that it is now 4 out of 6 classes, rather than being like 4th out of 5, so things are a little bit different to consider now. Next up then is the Necromancer, and I don't have great news for Necromancers honestly. In Season 5, the PTR, the 2 main builds that were really doing well were Bone Spirit, which most players feel is just sort of unfun to actually manage, and Blood Wave, which while strong has a lot of struggles with single target damage, which is a pretty important part of the game in a lot of the endgame activities. Since the PTR, the main changes are the Unmaker, unique helmet, losing the ability to let you have 2 ultimate skills equipped at the same time as a Necromancer, which honestly maybe a little bit broken, but also at the same time a unique that lets you have 2 ultimates is sort of a really cool idea. As well, they changed the actual affix on this, having ranks to Soul Rift on it removed and instead replaced with chance for Soul Rift to deal double damage. This is a bit of a sad change for a build concept that was already looking to have a bit of a cap on it, as now you can't reduce the cooldown on Soul Rift by just having higher ranks. The only real promising thing going on in the patch hitting live servers for Necromancer though is a few differing buffs to minion-based builds. This will make them overlap better with your existing skills, with your paragon, and some unique and legendary effects too that will now actually scale with minion damage stat increases. Minions before this were just too weak to be overly worth consideration as a focus in higher tier content, and we'll have to see exactly how this shakes out, but based on prior balancing attempts for minions, this will likely either not be enough and minions will still be way lower power than they should be, or it'll be an overcorrection and minions will be the strongest build for the class. So we'll sort of have to just see how it all plays out on live servers, but that is what the basic state of things looks like right now. After that is Rogue, and Rogue had a real roller coaster of a set of changes. In Season 5, they had multiple really solid builds, and honestly, to put it simply, there have been a fair amount of changes around the game at large, not even necessarily to Rogue specifically, that have lowered Rogue's average power a fair amount, including the reduction of a ton of additive bonuses that were around on the PTR and functioned extremely well with Rogue. But the main new thing that had popped up doing high damage on the PTR was Dance of Knives, the new skill for Rogue, and specifically with both Victimize as a key passive, which is lucky hit chance to apply big damage. On the PTR itself, it was clear that Dance of Knives was a bit bugged, as there was no management of stacks required for the skill, which essentially just created builds where it was a main button that you pressed, and the devs did express that wasn't quite the intended function for it. But these patch notes don't expand on that a massive amount, honestly. Past that, Victimize was changed in a really funky way in general. The damage itself has been reduced by 25%, which is a pretty big hit in the first place, though it is something that just scales really heavily with vulnerable stats, so the more stats you get, the stronger it gets regardless. As well, they did a really strange change, which is now an internal cooldown between possible Victimized procs. So you cannot proc it over and over and over, but it does store up the damage of procs that don't go off to increase the damage the next time it does count and properly explode. This is pretty non-specific in the way that it actually works. We don't even know the internal cooldown for this, but the guaranteed result is that Victimize will just be worse at pack clearing than it currently is. This may have no impact at all against bosses really, we don't really know, but less frequent pops of damage means lesser enemies take longer to kill. It means there's a lot more RNG and a lot less consistency in your damage just as a whole. All in all, Rogue's old builds are for the most part still really good. Dance of Knives had a lot of promise in the PTR, but with the new changes, it's just sort of honestly hard to say how it'll function until we can really get onto it in game, but knowing that Rogue essentially has a whirlwind now is still fun, even if it isn't necessarily game-breakingly strong. Then we have Sorcerer, and this is possibly the hardest one to actually pin right now. Splintering Energy Lightning Spear builds was king in Season 5. It was the top of the PTR essentially as well. It showed no signs of stopping, and then bam, just right in the patch notes that we got yesterday, it was hit extremely hard. Also being the only class in the 2.02 patch section with actual class changes rather than just pure bug fixes. Unstable Currents as an ultimate no longer counts its bonus skill casts as full casts that trigger effects or aspects. Lightning Spear is now capped at 12 being out at a time, and then Splintering Energy has a similar change to Victimize for Rogue, where it can now only trigger damage 5 times per second maximum, but the actual proc damage increases in effectiveness for each proc that would have happened in between them. So less frequent, but larger procs, which makes the Lightning Spear build just less consistent really. And then as if that wasn't enough, they also moved the cooldown reduction for Conjuration skills affix from Fractured Winterglass into now being an implicit affix instead of a proper affix, which of course means that you can't get a greater affix roll on it anymore, you can't masterwork it to be higher than it is currently, and that's an absolutely massive hit. You are stuck with that roll no matter what. Overall, this is a really hefty hit to Lightning Spear builds in general. It will probably take it out of contention for being the best build in the game, but it will quite possibly still be the best build for Sorcerer, unless something like the aspect of Constellation changes are actually real and not a typo, because I don't know if you're seeing what I'm seeing here, but in these patch notes, it says the damage has been changed from 50 to 70% weapon damage, all the way to 50 to 1050%, and 1050% weapon damage is just an insane damage proc. There's no way around that. If this makes it to live, and this is the real number that will hit, there will be strong builds based entirely around that aspect. But it is such a wild number change out of nowhere that it's hard to know exactly how strong it will be, and if it'll even actually come to the game like that, until we of course have our own hands on with it. I know I've said that a few times today, but it's just the reality of the situation. I can tell you the likely shifts from the patch notes, but testing will be required properly before we know exactly how much of a difference all this truly makes. That said, let's finish off today with our first section in a video like this for the new class Spiritborn. Spiritborn hasn't had any changes from Season 5 because it was not in Season 5, but we can talk about the sort of expectation of performance from this class this season. Being a new class in general to the game, the developers will almost guaranteed make it stronger rather than weaker. That's just the best way to introduce new things to a game like this, and it also is a class with such a large amount of depth and options between the 16 different potential combinations of Spirit Hall choices, the various interactions between skill tags that this class has with its uniques and things like that, and just essentially the mashing of 4 different archetypes into one singular class that can all mix and mingle just however you choose. Chances are very high there will just be some sort of broken combination with this class that completely destroys the game. And I'd argue chances are high there will be more than one broken interaction with the class that does exactly that. But this is the one most up in the air for the simple reason that we just need to be able to play it first. So I'm sure we'll have a lot more to talk about with this class after the review embargo is up relatively soon. But for now, this is where it stands from known knowledge. That just about does it for today then, everyone, and for the sake of it, because I know people like rankings, my overall assumptions from all this information: Necromancer will be the lowest performing class next season, followed by Barbarian and Druid quite close to each other outside of that. Then Rogue and Sorcerer will probably be fighting for 2nd and 3rd place between themselves, depending on how their new internal cooldown situations pan out in game. Then I expect Spiritborn to just have the largest number of high-powered endgame blasting builds because it's the new class. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, more or less just a discussion on how each class is looking now that we've had both the PTR and this extra patch applied to after the fact, now that we know how classes are likely to look coming to live servers. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.